Chapter 30. Vanessa stared at her computer thinking of Teo's most recent letters. She had remembered something that her mother once told her about love, and she tried to remember when the conversation had taken place, deciding that it must have been late in the summer of 1967. They had been sitting in the garden, she with a book on her lap and mother doing cross-stitch. It was one of those rare warm English summers. Mother could have been telling any story, the mere cadence of her voice was enough to soothe, but it wasn't just any old story. In retrospect, Vanessa wished she had asked more questions, but at the time she could only think of how things related to her and Teo. Now she wondered what the story might have meant to Mother, and who might have told her the story. Her mother had told her that there was a saying among the Hausa that a person never married their first love. A person always married someone else. But later in life that person would be reunited with their first love. The Hausa apparently even had a phrase for it. They called it the pick up your stick and sandals marriage, which referred to the way that an old man would go and visit his childhood sweetheart later in life. The woman cooked, the man brought presents, and then they shared companionship. Pick up your stick and sandals. Vanessa repeated to herself, hitting the space key to banish the silly animated fish that floated across her screen every time she stopped working. In large letters at the top of the page popped the title, Shona Art, Stunning Sculpture from Zimbabwe Takes Art World by Storm. Her fingers lingered on the keys. If there was indeed Mother's first love, what did the Hausa say for those who married first loves only to be disappointed later in life? And what did other African cultures have to say about romantic love? She hit the space key again. The article was due tomorrow and she had been wasting time. She would begin with a brief history of prouncve I at the National Gallery of Rhodesia and his role in encouraging art in the 1950s. Then she would describe Tom Bloomfield and the establishment of the Tenjinenge community in the 1960s, paying special attention to Agnes Nyanhongo and Kalima Jamb. More on women sculptors, she made a mental note. She shook her hair out of its loose ponytail, rolled her chair closer to the desk and placed her fingers back on the keys. At a time when reports from Africa are dominated by famine, starvation, and AIDS, Shona Art holds the promise of. She did not want to start like this, but it seemed the only way to move the reader on from the pervasive images of naked, skeletal Africans with flies buzzing round their faces. On was it? This dilemma always presented itself. Was she, in fact, perpetuating stereotypes by mentioning them, or was she helping readers to see past the clichés? And who was her audience these days? British lefties? Immigrants? African students? Or all three? She stared absently at the screen and wondered if she should abandon the whole thing. Eventually she stood up and went to the kitchen. There she poured herself some wine and, as she drank, she peered into the cupboards thinking she should shelf his box of bran flakes and her Swiss muesli. Nothing caught her fancy, so she wandered into the lounge, leaving her glass behind. The balloons from Saturday's party were still stuck to the ceiling. One popped. As she opened the French windows to catch some fresh air, the room smelt of old wine and cigarettes. Outside it was still drizzling. She picked up another glass and poured another drink, holding the bottle with one hand and tapping its skinny neck with her wedding band. This was the real English summer, grey and rainy. What a dismal country. She turned back to the room and saw that there Wind had blown off most of the cards from the bookshelves and mantelpiece. Saturday had been another of Edward's surprises. He was good at this, but she didn't like the unexpected anymore, especially not when it involved lots of people. She had secretly hoped that he might surprise her differently. He might have cooked, or taken her for a ride in the country, just the two of them. Of course she had smiled all evening, suffering and smiling. She played the required role, saying how blessed she felt, how wonderful it was to turn 50, what nonsense, but all the time she was wishing she could disappear. Edward had bought her several CDs, picking the music he thought she liked. The best of Sarah Vaughan, the best of Miles Davis. She hated Besto/S. Sully. Man had asked her what she wanted for her birthday and had taken her at her word when she said nothing, presenting her with a token bunch of wilting flowers, still wrapped in crinkly Tesco paper marked, Summer Special 14.99. He might as well just have picked something from the garden. At least that would have shown originality. And then they had parted so badly when she had driven him to the airport. "Well, you drive then," she had finally shouted after Suleiman kept complaining about her driving. "I should have never let you take me anyway," he grumbled. "I was perfectly happy catching the tube." And it was true. He had not wanted her to drive him to Heathrow, but she felt that as a mother she ought to. He was going to Senegal for an indefinite period of time. Of course she should take him. "You've never wanted me to do this trip anyway." 10 meters happy you're going, Suleiman, but it's just the timing. You haven't finished university, and what happens when you return? Who said I'm coming back? Don't be so ridiculous. Ah, fuck you, Mum. What? She slammed her foot against the brakes, skidding onto the hard shoulder. How dare you speak to your mother like that? Mother? What mother? Did you think you were doing some nice charity work for Africa when you decided to adopt me? She drove off again, speeding this time. If that was how he felt, then fuck him too. She would drop him and leave. You just thought you'd take me out of Africa, didn't you, and turn me into some middle-class bourgeois project. You thought you could send me to Ox_Ford or Cambridge, and I'd come out looking like you or Dad, collecting nice art from Africa, writing nice stories about Africa. Well, that's fucked up. I'm going back to learn about where I came from and to mix with my Muslim brothers and sisters. A place where Islam is respected and revered, and not mocked like it is in this fucking place. Go then, she shouted, but remember I adopted you because I love you. Because your mum was my best friend and I promised Suleiman to take care of you. Call us your bourgeois parents, if that makes you feel better, but I've never, ever, tried to mold you into anything. And then it was silence all the way until just before he went through security. With tears in her eyes she had watched him disappear, her tall, handsome son. And all the phases of his life flashed by. The day that Suleiman died and their years that followed in Dakar. Of them making toys together out of cardboard boxes and empty fairy liquid bottles, swimming in the sea, nursing him back to health after his fevers, leaving for England to see Grandma before she died. When Suleiman had been ecstatic to travel for the first time on an aeroplane. He had loved England then, THC changing seasons, fish and chips, Cadbury's, chocolates and his new school. Even the teenage years had not been difficult. But then came university. She worried constantly about him, especially now that he was so far away. What were Teo's words? It is a stage he is going through, and it will pass. You will see. She longed for Teo now. She stood up, closed the back doors, and stared for a moment at the wine bottle on the shelf. She left it where it stood, empty between the fallen cards. She had received 2 letters from Teo yesterday. In one, he had asked about her faith. "Tell you about my faith?" She mumbled to herself. "How can I speak of it when I'm like this?" She covered her face with her hands. "Look at me now, just 100k at me." But in his letter he had also mentioned the possibility of a visit, and at that thought she lifted her hands from her face, flicked away the tears and began to write. "My dear Teo, if only you knew what happens when your letters arrive, if only you knew. There was the letter you wrote to me, Indiana 19673, the letter we both avoided talking about when we saw each other last. Have you ever imagined the pain it caused me? Had it not been for Mother, but I will tell you one day. And now you have written again, and I am filled with despair, depression perhaps. Although I hate the word depress, is 0n, so gloomy and self-indulgent. I'm sure I never once heard the word used in Africa. There was no time to be depressed. Of course people had their anxieties, but it wasn't as spoken of as it is here in EU. Rope. Perhaps when depression is discussed, scrutinized, it leads to more of it. But today your letter has lifted my spirits, and as I think of you I too imagine what life would be like with. Do you sometimes think the same? I tell myself that you do, but then I fear that this is just what married people use as an escape. Perhaps we all cling to fantasies of some other person that allow us to keep going with our day-to-day lives. I wonder if this is what my parents did. Father always working, mother drinking. There must have been else in their lives, some hope. And now, when I look at myself, not that anything is terribly wrong, but I long to be in love again. I want Sion to be with you. One wonder if you have ever come across the saying, pick up your stick and sandals marriage. This was what Mother called it. I don't know where she heard it, or whether it even exists, but she said it was a horse, a belief that in later age one is reunited with one's first love. Perhaps it was just a story to console the lovelorn. I know that everything would not be pure bliss between us, no marriage ever is, but I like to dream, and when have I not? I was born with a restlessness in my soul, the restlessness of an artist who is never fully satisfied. One moment I long to be surrounded by friends, and in another I am wishing to be alone, far away from anyone I know. Is this me being selfish, or is it simply a function of growing old? I certainly don't recall feeling this way in my 20s or 30s. So you see, when you ask me about faith, I'm hardly the person to talk. My faith is weak. I strive to be closer to God, to release myself from self-centeredness, but with little success. The issue of suffering that you raised in your last letter has always bothered me, always. Vanessa stopped and highlighted the text. She paused, then pressed delete.